You are holding a letter that predicts the end of your empire, and the man who wrote it is not a prophet, not an enemy, not a foreigner. He is one of your own officials, and he wrote it more than 300 years before anyone else agreed with him. This is not a metaphor. This actually happened. In 1631, a palace official named Koçi Bey handed Sultan Murad IV a memorandum, not a poem, not a warning wrapped in riddles, a direct, itemized diagnosis of exactly how the Ottoman Empire was going to fall apart, written while that empire still controlled 3 continents and looked from the outside unstoppable. Picture the room. You're an advisor standing just behind the Sultan's shoulder as he reads. Outside the palace walls, the empire still stretches from Budapest to Baghdad, from Algiers to the Persian border. Tribute still flows in. The bureaucracy still runs. If you stepped outside right now and asked anyone in the market whether the empire was declining, they would look at you like you'd asked whether the sun was declining. And yet the document in the Sultan's hands says otherwise, in plain language, with specific causes and specific fixes. Why would anyone believe him? Because Koçi Bey wasn't guessing. He was pointing at a system and describing exactly where the gears had started grinding against each other. Start with the Timar system because almost nothing else makes sense without it. Think of a Timar as a land grant instead of a salary. A cavalry soldier didn't get paid in coin from the treasury. He got assigned a piece of land, and the taxes from that land supported him and his equipment. It was efficient in a specific way. The empire didn't need to move huge amounts of cash around to maintain an army. But it only worked if the land grants stayed properly tracked, properly reassigned, and properly tied to actual military service. By the early 17th century, that tracking had started to rot from the inside. Grants meant for soldiers were quietly ending up in the hands of court favorites, tax farmers, and administrators who had never swung a sword in their lives. Koçi Bey names this directly. He's not being poetic about moral decay. He's pointing at a specific administrative failure. The register no longer matched reality, and every mismatch meant a soldier who wasn't where he was supposed to be, or worse, a soldier who existed only on paper. Here's where it gets concrete enough to actually feel. Imagine you're a district governor, and the tax rolls tell you there are 40 cavalrymen supported by land in your province. You ride out to inspect them the way officials sometimes did, and you find maybe 25 actual soldiers, some elderly, some with equipment that hasn't been maintained in a decade, because the land tied to the other 15 positions has been quietly absorbed by a wealthy relative of someone at court. The register says 40. The frontier gets 25, and not the 25 best 25. Now scale that gap across the entire empire over decades, and you start to understand what Koçi Bey was actually warning about. Not moral collapse, institutional drift, a system that looked identical from a distance and was hollowing out up close. The historian Cemal Kafadar has spent much of his career examining exactly this kind of Ottoman decline literature, and he makes a point that reframes the whole story. These memoranda weren't objective diagnoses handed down from some neutral position outside the system. They were written by officials who had their own stakes in how reform should go, often idealizing an earlier golden age that was itself partly invented for rhetorical effect. In other words, even the warning itself was shaped by the interests of the person writing it. That doesn't make Koçi Bey wrong. It makes him human, and it makes his prediction more interesting, not less. He wasn't a detached oracle. He was an insider with a diagnosis and an agenda, and the diagnosis turned out to describe a real structural weakness even if the golden age he was comparing it to was partly nostalgia. The historian Halil İnalcık, one of the most influential scholars of Ottoman economic history, traced a second thread running underneath the Timar problem: currency debasement. The aki, the empire's silver coin, kept losing value across the 16th and 17th centuries, partly because of a flood of cheap American silver arriving through European trade routes, which devalued silver everywhere it touched, and partly because the treasury kept reducing the coin's silver content to stretch its own spending power. Sound familiar? It's the same trick Rome pulled with its own coinage more than 1,000 years earlier, and it produces the same result every time. Soldiers paid in a currency that buys less bread than it used to are soldiers who start looking for other ways to get paid, and a Timar system built on land instead of coin becomes even more attractive to abuse when actual coin is worth less and less. Picture the market scene, because this is where an abstract economic term becomes something you can actually feel. You're a merchant in Istanbul in the 1620s, and the same silver aki that bought a certain weight of bread 10 years ago now buys noticeably less. You don't need an economist to explain debasement to you. You just watch your own coins buy less every year, while officials insist nothing fundamental has changed. Now here's the part that makes this genuinely different from most collapse stories, and it's the twist almost nobody expects. Koçi Bey's memorandum didn't cause a collapse in 1631, and it didn't even predict a collapse in the way people usually mean that word. The Ottoman Empire didn't fall for nearly 300 more years, finally dissolving after the First World War in 1922. 3 centuries is longer than the entire history of the United States. If this was a terminal diagnosis, it described one of the slowest deaths of any political institution in recorded history. The scholar Rifa'at Abou-El-Haj pushed back hard against the idea that any of this should be called decline at all, at least not in the simple sense the word implies. He argued that what Koçi Bey and other officials were actually documenting wasn't an empire dying, but an empire transforming, shifting power away from the Sultan and central administration toward provincial elites, local power brokers, and new economic arrangements that the old Timar system had never been designed to accommodate. The empire didn't fail to adapt. It adapted in ways that broke the old system while building new ones that later generations of historians, looking backward, mistook for pure decay. So which is it? A prediction that came true, or a diagnosis of change mistaken for death? Maybe both. The specific institutional weaknesses Koçi Bey identified were real, and many of them did eventually contribute to the empire's much later dissolution. But the timeline reveals something almost nobody expects from a collapse story. Identifying a structural problem accurately and having that problem eventually matter are two very different things separated by generations of adaptation, patching, and quiet reinvention in between. Does that sound familiar? Think about every confident prediction you've heard about some system, a currency, an industry, an institution being doomed within the decade. Sometimes those predictions are simply wrong, but sometimes they're describing a real structural weakness accurately and still turn out to be wrong about the timeline because systems under stress don't just break. They adapt, they redistribute power internally, they find new arrangements nobody planned for, and they keep functioning in a transformed state for far longer than the original diagnosis implied. You are not being asked to distrust every warning you hear. You're being asked to hold two things at once. A warning can correctly identify a real weakness and still be wrong about when or even whether that weakness produces the ending everyone assumes is coming. Koçi Bey saw something true about the Timar system and the debased Aki. He was right about the mechanism. He was wrong by nearly 3 centuries about the clock. Let's go back to that district governor riding out to inspect his 40 registered cavalrymen. What he does next matters because it shows exactly how a system absorbs a problem instead of confronting it. He doesn't report the 15 missing soldiers as a crisis. He can't really because the people who benefit from those missing positions are often more powerful than he is. So the report gets softened. The numbers get adjusted just enough to avoid an uncomfortable confrontation with someone at court. Multiply that single quiet decision across hundreds of districts, across decades, and you get an empire whose paperwork looks intact while its actual military capacity has been slowly leaking away in 1,000 small, individually defensible decisions. This is the part that rarely makes it into the popular version of the story. Nobody in this system was necessarily acting in bad faith at any single moment. The district governor wasn't a traitor. The court favorite absorbing a Timar grant wasn't twirling a mustache and plotting the empire's ruin. Each decision taken alone was the path of least resistance for the person making it. It's only when you zoom out, the way Koçi Bey did, that the pattern becomes visible, and by the time it's visible enough to write down in a memorandum, it has already been accumulating for generations. Think about what that means for you, reading his memorandum centuries later. Koçi Bey wasn't uncovering some hidden conspiracy. He was doing something much harder and much rarer. He was naming a slow, distributed, mostly well-intentioned pattern of small decisions and showing the Sultan what they added up to when you finally added them up. That's a different skill than predicting a battle or a famine. It's closer to what a financial auditor does when a company's books look fine on the surface but the underlying cash flow tells a different story. Now widen the frame past the Timar system, because Koçi Bey's memorandum also spent real attention on something even less visible to outsiders: the growing power of the harem and inner palace household over appointments that used to run through the formal bureaucracy. Positions that were supposed to be earned through the debasement system, the practice of recruiting and training administrators and soldiers from among young men levied from provincial families, were increasingly going to people connected by patronage rather than by that formal training pipeline. Picture what that meant in practice. A position that once required years of training in the palace schools, learning administration, language, and military command, could now be secured through a favorable connection instead. The credential still existed on paper. The substance behind it had quietly changed. You would have felt this if you were a young man who had gone through the actual Debasement training, competing for a post against someone who walked in through a side door built entirely out of patronage. The frustration wouldn't have felt like watching an empire collapse. It would have felt like watching a system you trusted quietly stop rewarding the thing it claimed to reward. Here's where the modern mirror becomes almost uncomfortably direct. Historians who study institutional decline in modern governments and corporations describe something strikingly similar to what Koçi Bey was pointing at. A gap that opens up between an organization's formal rules and its actual informal way of getting things done. The rules stay on the books. The org chart looks the same, but the real channels of power and resource allocation drift somewhere else entirely, and by the time anyone writes a memo about it, the drift has usually been happening for a very long time. You are not being asked to distrust every organization you're part of. You're being asked to notice the difference between what a system says it rewards and what it actually rewards in practice, because that gap, more than any single dramatic failure, is usually where the real story is hiding. Koçi Bey saw something true about the Timar system and the debased Aki. He was right about the mechanism. He was wrong by nearly 3 centuries about the clock. You are holding a letter that predicted the end of an empire, and the man who wrote it died believing he had failed to save it, 300 years before anyone could prove whether he was right.